The most iconic car ever made by every major car maker. It could describe a car which encapsulates the history and ethos of its maker, or an outstanding model with no relation to anything else wearing the same badge. Or it could refer to something else entirely. Whatever the definition, we believe that 50 manufacturers have produced cars which could be considered iconic in one way or another, such as their wider cultural impact, or the way they represent the values of their maker. Here they are, in alphabetical order, and as voted for by Autocar staff members. You're welcome to disagree with our choices, but we hope you'll be satisfied with at least some of them. AC Cobra. There's a lot more to AC than just the Cobra, but this is by far its most famous model. It was devised by Carroll Shelby, who felt that there was nothing wrong with AC's Ace sports car that couldn't be fixed by making a small block Ford Windsor V8 engine, or, later, a big block FE, fit under the bonnet. Alpine A110. The original A110 started out in the 1960s as an attractive but not particularly fast sports car with Renault components. Within a decade, it had become the most successful rally car on the planet, demolishing both Fiat and Ford on its way to winning the 1973 World Rally Championship. Alfa Romeo GT-AM. The GT-AM was the most exciting derivative of the GTA, itself the smart-looking coupe version of the much boxier 1960s Giulia saloon. Initially known as the 1750 GT-AM, but, despite the name, powered by a 2.0-liter twin-spark engine. It was built in very small numbers by Autodelta as a homologation special, devised simply to allow Alfa Romeo to use it in touring car racing. Austin 7. Goodness knows Austin produced some memorable cars over the years, but if we had to pick one which we literally just did, it would have to be the 7. In a sense, this was a smaller, British equivalent of the Ford Model T, a cheap and simple but proper car which was within the means of buyers who might previously have had to make do with a far less appealing cycle car. Austin Healey 3000. The 3000 was the last and greatest of the big Healeys, co-developed by BMC and the Healey Sports Car Company. Derived from earlier 100 series models, it was fitted with a 2.9-liter version of the BMC C series engine more commonly found in large saloons. Bentley Arnage. If one car represents the entire history of the Bentley marque, it's the Arnage. It was named after a corner at the Le Mans circuit, where Bentley won the 24-hour race 5 times between 1924 and 1930, and was mostly powered by a development of the 6.75-liter L-Series 5.8 engine which dated back to 1959. BMC Mini. At least historically, if not financially, the Mini was the crowning achievement of the British Motor Corporation. In fact, it was never branded BMC, because nothing was, but instead wore the badges of Austin, Morris, Innocenti, Authy and, in 3-box saloon form, Riley and Wolseley, though it was eventually sold simply as Mini. BMW M3 E30. BMW has been producing M3 performance saloons since 1986, and they have all been magnificent in their way, but there's a magic to the original E30 model which, we think, has never quite been captured since. It was the only one in the series with a 4-cylinder engine, of either 2.3 or 2.5 liters. And if you think that's disappointing, you probably haven't heard one screaming away at full throttle. Buick Riviera, first generation. Buick first used the Riviera name for the 2-door hardtop version of the Roadmaster in the 1949 model year before applying it to a separate model over 8 generations. As with the BMW M3, the first of these is the one which floats our boat most effortlessly. It doesn't hurt that the smaller of the 2 available Nailhead V8 engines measured 6.6 liters, the larger was a 7.0, but it's mostly about the styling, courtesy of GM design chief Bill Mitchell. It could easily have been a Cadillac, where indeed it was originally destined. Cadillac Escalade. There are many reasons to recoil at the idea of Cadillac being represented by the Escalade on this list. You might feel it doesn't bear comparison with a 1950s Eldorado or a 1930s V16, or maybe you feel uncomfortable about a vehicle favored by LA-based celebrities, or perhaps you detest enormous SUVs. But there's no doubt that it has been the GM luxury brand's great success story of the 21st century so far. Chevrolet Corvette. There is simply no argument about this one. The first-generation Corvette might have been a slow seller to begin with, but it took off when Chevy made its new small-block V8 engine available in 1955, and it has been at the top of the game ever since. claims that it is the world's most successful sports car in automotive history are as solid as the Rockies. Chrysler 300. Chrysler produced a great many cars called 300 in the 20th century, most of them in either the letter or non-letter series. Our choice isn't one of those. Instead, we've gone for the much more recent 300, sold in Europe as the 300C, though this was applied only to lower spec versions in North America, which has been produced in 2 generations since the 2005 model year, and was also briefly marketed as the Lancia Tema. Citroën DS. It could have been the 2CV, but no, we went instead for the much grander DS range. While the 2CV had contemporary rivals, the DS was the car the rest of the motor industry took a long time to catch up with, to the extent that it did at all. From the start, it had hydropneumatic suspension and high-level rear indicators. In 1967, 12 years into its life, these were joined by directional headlights, which made the DS even more exotic than it had been originally. Datsun 240Z. Known in Japan as the Nissan Fairlady Z, this was the first in a long series of high-performance coupes with increasingly large numbers in their titles to reflect the rise in the capacities of their, always 6-cylinder, engines, at least until the current model, known simply as the Nissan Z, came along in 2022. De Tomaso Pantera. The Pantera was by far the most successful model from the small Italian company founded in 1959 by Alejandro de Tomaso. 1928-2003. It was preceded by the Velunga, which had a 1.5-liter pre-crossflow Ford Kent engine, and by the much more powerful V8 Mangusta, which was rather tail-heavy and reportedly quite a handful to drive. Dodge Charger Daytona. Dodge has produced 3 Charger Daytonas, but there's no doubt that the first was the most spectacular of them all. It was one of the Winged Warriors, a subset of the Aero Warriors built for sale to the public in just enough numbers for them to be eligible for NASCAR racing. A regular Charger in most respects, it had an aerodynamic nose to reduce drag and an enormous rear wing to increase downforce. Ferrari F40. The F40 was the last Ferrari road car to enter production during the lifetime of Enzo Ferrari, 1898-1988, and was named for the fact that it was announced during the 40th anniversary year of the company building its first car under its own name. Fiat Nuova 500. Fiat has created several models called 500, or Cinquecento, which means the same thing in Italian, but the most celebrated of them all is the second in the line. It manufactured from 1957 to 1975, and was known originally as the Nuova, or New, 500 to distinguish it from the pre-war version usually referred to as the Topolino. Ford Model T. The most iconic Ford? The Model T might be the most iconic car, full stop. It was intended to put Americans, and to some extent people in other parts of the world, on the road and, for better or worse, it did. With the help of the industry's first moving assembly line, Ford built around 15 million examples, a very high figure now and quite astonishing for the period from 1908 to 1927. Hillman Imp. The Imp was as out of character for Hillman as a 2-seater sports car would be today for Dacia. Introduced in 1963, in the decade when the brand's lineup included the very conventional Minx and Hunter, it was by far the smallest Hillman, a direct rival to the Mini, and the only one with a rear-mounted engine. Hindustan Ambassador. Motorists who live far from India have little reason to know much about Hindustan Motors. If they do, it's almost certainly because of the extraordinary Ambassador. This started out in 1957 as a locally built third-generation Morris Oxford but was gradually developed over the years, latterly being powered by Isuzu engines. Holden Maloo. Australians are very fond of high-performance, saloon-based pickup trucks known locally as utes. One of the most famous is the Maloo, which was based on several generations of the Commodore, and is our favorite Holden. Honda Civic Type R. Yes, of course we know about the NSX, but it's the hot hatch version of Honda's mid-sized hatchback that gets our vote. The little monster is now in its 6th generation, having made its debut in 1997 with a high-revving and very powerful 1.6-liter engine. Hummer H1. It's possible to look critically at every Hummer, even the relatively small H3 or the current pickup EV which, though colossal, is at least powered by electric motors rather than a heavily polluting internal combustion engine. However, no Hummer has ever been viewed with such a polarized mixture of admiration and horror as the original H1, which is why we think it's the most iconic. Jaguar E-Type. Known officially in North America as the XKE, the E-Type was introduced in 1961 as the latest in a line of two-seat Jaguar sports cars. It was technically innovative, it was powered by a proven 6-cylinder engine, later joined by a V12, and it was competitively priced. Lamborghini Countach. We haven't actually researched this, but it seems likely that the Countach featured on more posters on car-loving children's bedroom walls in the 1970s than any other Lamborghini. For its day, it looked incredible, with its low, wide, wedge-shaped body and the amazing feature of scissor doors. When it was launched in 1974, there was simply nothing like it on sale. Lancia Stratus. In the early 1970s, Lancia did well in international rallying with the Fulvia HF, a front-wheel drive coupe with a 1.6-liter V4 engine, but the sport was developing so rapidly that something else would clearly be required soon. The Stratus, introduced in 1974, represented an almost unbelievable leap forward. It was vastly more modern than the Fulvia, and had a Ferrari Dino V6 engine mounted between the rear wheels. Lincoln Continental, 1970s. The Continental of this decade was one of the grandest U.S. luxury cars, and in a way represented the end of this type of vehicle as it had previously been understood. To some extent, it was also a step backwards. From 1958 to 1969, Continentals had featured unibody construction, by then the obvious way to build a car, but for 1970 Lincoln reverted to the old-fashioned body-on-frame method. Lotus Elise. If Lotus fans had been given a vote here, there would have been a lot of support for the 7, the original Elite and the first-generation Elan, and there's a strong case to be made for all of them. However, we've gone for the Elise, which is certainly the most iconic Lotus of the modern era, and arguably of the company's long history. Mazda MX-5. The small, open two-seater sports car with a front-mounted engine and rear-wheel drive, of which so many had been produced earlier in the century, was almost extinct when Mazda launched the MX-5, or Miata or Unos, depending on where it was sold, in 1989. The Japanese company therefore had this sector of the market almost to itself, but that was no guarantee of success. Mercedes 300 SL Gullwing. The 300 SL was an outlier in the Mercedes lineup of the 1950s, and was not originally planned as a road car at all. It started out as a not very powerful, but exceptionally light and aerodynamic, sports racer which finished first and second in both the Le Mans 24 Hours and Mexico's Carrera Panamericana in 1952. MG MGB. The MGB was the first road-going MG sports car with unibody construction rather than a body bolted onto a chassis. It was available as both a roadster and a coupe, the latter known as the MGB GT, and had a very production run from 1962 to 1980. In that time, it became the first MG to reach sales of 500,000. Mitsubishi Evo. In each of its 10 generations, the Evolution derivative of the Mitsubishi Lancer was a four-door saloon with four-wheel drive and a turbocharged 2.0-liter petrol engine. In 2014, Mitsubishi UK, celebrating its 40th anniversary, built 40 examples of the Evo XFQ 440 Mr., which produced, as its name suggested, 440 bhp. At 220.2 bhp per liter, this is the highest specific output of any four-cylinder road car, and second overall only to the Koenigsegg Jesko. Nissan Skyline GTR. Like the Datsun 240Z mentioned earlier, the Skyline GTR is an outlier in the Nissan range. It's almost unbelievable that the company which produced the Micra, the Qashqai and the Sunny could also come up with something like this. Opel Manta. For a mainstream manufacturer, Opel has built some astonishing cars, including the enormous 24 110ths Regent luxury model of the late 1920s and the beautiful little two-seater GT of 1968-1973. But if we're going to name the brand's iconic model, it has to be the Manta. Peugeot 205 GTI. By the 1980s, Peugeot had developed a reputation for producing good but unadventurous cars. That changed dramatically in 1983 when the company's 104 was replaced by the 205. This was immediately hailed as one of the finest European superminis, and it is still thought of in similar terms 4 decades later. Porsche 911. It's not even close. There have been many great Porsches over the years, but this is the one everybody knows about and nearly everybody wants to have. Porsche did its best with a series of front-engine sports cars, but none of them survived the 20th century. The rear-engine 911 has been around for 60 years, and there's no sign of it ever going away. Renault Clio. Renault had an extremely hard act to follow when the time came to replace the 5, which had been produced in 2 generations since 1972. Its next Super Mini might also have been called the 5, but by 1990 company policy dictated that Renaults had to be given names rather than numbers, so it became known as the Clio. Rolls-Royce Phantom, 7th generation. Over nearly a century, though with some gaps, there have been 8 generations of Phantom. As the most iconic Rolls-Royce, we've nominated the 7th, which was launched in 2003, and was the company's only offering for several years. Rover SD1. The SD1 might have been the most shocking mainstream British car introduced in the 1970s. The old, anti-Rover, jibe suddenly became irrelevant when this astonishingly modern-looking car hit the market, transforming the public perception of the brand like no model before or since. Saab 96. The 96 did not spring from nowhere. It was an evolution of Saab's first model, the 92, and the succeeding 93. But it was the ultimate Saab of its era, not least because it bridged the old and new, being fitted originally with a tiny 2-stroke engine and later with a Ford V4. Seat Ibiza. There was some enthusiasm among our voters for the Seat 600, which contributed enormously to the Spanish economic miracle, but in the end we went for the Ibiza. It was introduced in 1984, became the first car marketed in the UK as a seat the following year, and is still the brand's Super Mini representative nearly 40 years later. Studebaker Avanti. The short-lived but fascinating Avanti was very fast for a car of the early 1960s, and extremely unusual for the time in having disc brakes at the front. Despite all that, it's an icon more because of its futuristic fiberglass body, designed by Raymond Loewy, 1893-1986, and looking absolutely nothing like that of the Studebaker Lark, which shared the same chassis. Subaru Impreza. Until the late 1980s, Subaru was a subject of only mild interest outside Japan. The legacy moved things forward a long way, but the big change came with the introduction of the smaller Impreza. While the legacy had done well in international rallying, the Impreza became one of the dominant cars in the sport, bringing Subaru unprecedented levels of global publicity. Tesla Model S. Say what you like about Tesla, and almost everyone does, it has become a very significant part of the motoring world in little more than a decade. That's not because of its first model, the Lotus Elise-based Roadster, an interesting device but aimed at a small corner of the market. Toyota Land Cruiser. The Land Cruiser name was first used in 1954, but it was applied to a vehicle launched 3 years earlier, so in a sense Land Cruisers have been around for over 7 decades. There is almost no connection between the current model and the original Jeep-like military vehicle, but that's part of the point. Vauxhall Lotus Carlton. The Lotus Carlton is one of those icons which stands out from everything else its maker produced. Each of the small number of cars built left the Opel factory in Russelsheim as a Vauxhall Carlton, or Opel Omega 3.0 GSI, and was then taken to the Lotus factory in Hethel, where the straight-six engine was enlarged to 3.6 liters and fitted with twin turbochargers. Volkswagen Golf. Historically, of course, the Beetle is the iconic VW, the first car to be built in greater numbers than the Ford Model T. Without it, there would be no Volkswagen today, and conceivably no Audi, Seat or Skoda either. Volvo 850. If there's one type of car Volvo is particularly known for, it's the large saloon, or more specifically the large estate. The 850 was in production only in the early to mid-1990s, but it's an excellent example, and it also marked a turning point for the company.